Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lessons, we're going to be discussing the first 11 verses of the fourth chapter of the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is arranged in 5 chapters, each with a theme, the first 4 of which are acrostics, which is a literary device whereby the opening letter of each verse begins in the narrative progression of the Hebrew alphabet. So it would have been from Aleph to Tau. That was their A to Z. The first verse, the opening word in their language corresponds to Aleph. The closing of the 22nd corresponds to Tau, and everything in between starts with and begins with everything that comes in between Aleph and Tau. And the third chapter is not, all of these are 22 verses or some division of the third chapter. The longest one is 66 verses, and that it is not 3 acrostics, but a single acrostic. So what it does is follows that formula on a 3-fold level. So in other words, the first words of the first 3 verses all begin with Aleph and Tau, and the 64th through 66 all begin with Tau, Aleph for the ones. And the theme of each is, in the first chapter, read of the sorrow in Jerusalem. Jeremiah reports as a first-hand witness living in the devastation, degradation, and ruin of the land upon which he has when everything he warned had come to pass because everything he warned against that went unheeded. So he had to live with the spectacle and the witness of what he was called to prophesy, the eventual extinction of the Jewish state. And then in the second chapter, we read at Yahweh's anger at sin. He has done what he has done because he is angry at the sin of the covenant nation Judah. And in the third chapter, we read of the hope of Yahweh's faithfulness. So through it all, there's a lot of poetic expressions and verbal acclamations to this hope that he is faithful by nature. But in the fourth chapter, the theme is Yahweh's anger being satisfied. So we feel it more appropriate to connect it thematically to the second chapter in our pre-exegetical area of focus. Preamble. So remember this, his anger at sin, Yahweh's anger at sin, is the main theme of this chapter. So how Yahweh in his displeasure has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud. He has cast down from the heavens to the earth the comeliness of Israel, and he has not remembered his footstool in the day of his displeasure. So he's not speaking of a literal physical cloud, but a cloud of judgment which descends from heaven and visits the earth. The target of this is Zion, which is by connection Jerusalem, and by connection Judah. And he had not remembered his footstool. His footstool is on earth because he is in heaven, and this would have been remembered his own people in the day of his displeasure. Why? Because they had sinned. He had provided them with a covenant with consequences and warnings for disobedience and promises for blessings and prosperity in exchange, and as a result of obedience, and they had sinned away their day of grace. He had had enough, and he decided to uproot them and scatter them away from the promised land to refine them in the furnace of affliction in order to make them better Jews. The second verse we read, in his wrath he has thrown down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah and brought them down to the ground. Once more, the personal object of his wrath is Judah and her people. And the third verse we read, in the heat of his displeasure he has cut off every horn of Israel, and he burns against Jacob like a flaming fire, consuming all around. So his wrath is likened to a fire with an inexorable appetite and capacity for growth. It's literally consuming everyone around Jeremiah. So he's left to remain in the city, which is a ghost town and desolate ruin. And once more, in the tent of the daughter of Zion, he has poured out his wrath like fire. Fourth verse reiterates what the third verse says, that his rage and wrath is likened to fire. Yahweh has been like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up her palaces. He has destroyed her strongholds. He increases mourning and lamentation in the daughters of Judah. So he who had been their friend and their heavenly father was treating them like an enemy, and he consumed Israel, all their palaces, strongholds, etc., and amplified the cause for mourning and lamentation. That is the title of this book, in the daughters of Judah. So once more, Judah is his personal target of his wrath. He has made the appointed times and the Sabbath to be forgotten in Zion, and despised kings and the priest in his raging displeasure. So because his displeasure rages, his wrath is raging right now. He's in the midst of a fit of righteous wrath amongst not only the people, but specifically the kings and the priests. Now, they had a vital function to perform in the maintenance of the covenantal obligation-keeping process within the covenant nation. And because they had been derelict in their duties, there was no Sabbath or holidays to be celebrated, at least not in Zion, at least not anymore. Zion would have been the site and center of the temple. And much of what comes after this kind of elaborates on the loss of the religious life in Israel. You know, the prophet's warnings went unheeded, and they had allowed themselves to be lulled and swayed by false prophets and rejected and discarded the authentic prophet that he was. And then the 17th verse really sums up what I want to communicate before I communicate verse by verse and line by line the chapter we're actually going to be focusing on. I know this is a longer than usual preamble. Yahweh has done what he has planned. He has filled his word, which he commanded in days of old. He has torn down without mercy. He has let your enemy rejoice over you. He has exalted the horn of your adversaries. Now, they had ample warning to avoid this predicament, but Yahweh had determined, in response to their unrepentant and iniquitous, he fulfilled his promise in words, some of which was spoken from the mouth of Jeremiah, but Isaiah foretold the doom that Jeremiah was living and witnessing of, and also warned of when it was more chronologically imminent to his prophecy. He was living past it now, and he has allowed his enemies to rejoice and triumph over them, to do away with them, and he was their protector, yet for very good reason he did not protect them from the Babylonian invaders. So the first verse of the actual 4th chapter, this lesson is going to span the range of how dim the gold has become, the fine gold changed. The stones of the temple are scattered at the head of every street. Now, he's not referring to literal gold, but he's referring to Israel, which the nation of Israel or nation of Judah, whatever one you prefer, they were of such value in the estimation as the chosen people of the creator of the earth that their value was likened to gold. And yet they had changed. They had gone from the apple of his eye to the recipients of his wrath for their repeated egregious covenantal violations and the accompanying consequences. The temple was destroyed for the first time, and when the Savior predicts its eventual second destruction, the thus far irrecoverable one, he said that not a single stone would be left standing. The stones in the destruction of the first temple were all about and scattered all about the city, which wasn't really a city of order at this moment in time. The precious sons of Zion, who were weighed against fine gold, how they have been reckoned as clay pots, the works of the hands of the potter. So this elaborates more fully on the gold analogy I already expounded on. Gold was what they were meant to be, but because they did not measure up, and there was a distinct dichotomy of the difference of approach and attitude and treatment between Yahweh, their father, and their enemies' reckoning of them. He regarded them as gold. He treasured and valued them above all else. Their enemy treated them like clay pots. They are the works of the hands of the potter. this is a message Jeremiah communicates amongst other prophets in the 18th chapter of the book which bears his name, the argument being, what right have we to protest the manner in which we are made? Does a clay protest the way that the potter made him? Even jackals have presented their beasts, they have nursed their young. The daughter of my people has become as cruel as ostriches in the wildernesses. So the women of Jerusalem are at least reduced to a state of degradation worse than any beast. Even jackals, animals no one likes or actually, they're just not admirable animals, but they still care for their young, which the women of Judah are unable to do at this present moment in time because of the conditions of their city, and this has reduced them. The scarcity had generated widespread cruelty amongst them, which was comparable to ostriches in the wilderness. I think a jackal would be a more cruel animal than an ostrich, but I guess an ostrich in the wilderness can be a quite cruel animal. I have a very limited knowledge of biology. The tongue of the infant has clung to the roof of its mouth for thirst. Children ask for bread. No one breaks it for them. So the children, the young, do not have the physical food to nourish and sustain them. They are, or the water. Drought and famine are very real facts of life that they have to contend with and deal with through no fault of their own, and all they can do is ask for bread because they are children. Of course, no one, whatever bread anyone else has, they're storing for themselves. So the one of the sins of scarcity is that it invites hoarding of resources amongst oneself. Those who ate delicacies have been laid waste in the streets. Those who have brought up in scarlet have embraced dunghills. So they went from royalty to rags rather than from rags to riches. They were accustomed to some of the finer delicacies of life and food and cuisine. But here they were indistinct from a homeless man laid waste in the street. That means they're looking and acting, if not in actual fact, homeless. And scarlet would have been the color of the robe of the extremely wealthy because it was a rarer dye, and they were reduced to embracing the dunghills. The piles of poop is what a dunghill is. And the wickedness of the daughter of my people is greater than the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, and no hands were wrung over her. So the conditions of Sodom, which was the standard epicenter, ancient epicenter of iniquity, was that they had no special revelation. Israel did. They had the law, they had the prophets, they had the scriptures, they had the writings, but Sodom did what they did out of ignorance. They were base, carnal creatures who suffered particularly from an endemic of homosexuality. But in their defense, they had no special revelation, whereas Judah clearly did, and they had to endure the agonizing torture of a 2-year siege, whereas the fire and brimstone. Sodom and Gomorrah, its twin city of ancient iniquity, was reduced to smithereens in the twinkling of an eye, the standard fire and brimstone judgment, and there was no one to protect her but Jeremiah had predicted the 2-year siege. He had found himself in a dungeon towards the tail end of his ministry, at least while Judah functioned as a still struggling but still technically independently sovereign nation. He advised the surrender without resistance in the interest of preserving the temple in this city, the exquisite agony that the 2-year siege came to it because of it. So he suffered those 2 years in a dungeon, but the people he advised didn't have to suffer so severely if they only heeded his counsel. Her Nazarites were brighter than snow and whiter than milk, more ruddy in body than rubies, their cult like sapphire. So this is a vision of what once was. This is historical. This is not a prophecy. This is a remembrance. And what they have been reduced to forms the intensity of the contrast between what they are now and what they once were. What they once were. Now, a Nazarite was a vow, rarely initiated for lifetime, although there were some exceptions, some significant figures from the Old Testament scripture, Samson, possibly Samuel, and John the Baptist even was a Nazarite for life, but it was more often than not a 30-day or a 3-year vow where one would have refrained from certain things and do certain things. And there was a time in the Golden Age, the bygone era, when the Nazarites exuded a radiance that was whiter than milk, and they were more ruddy in body than rubies. Rubies is a precious gem, so that just shows how strong their bodies were, and they were cut like sapphire. Sapphire is another precious gem, so to compare a human body or a human being to these items is a compliment and an expression of their positive experiences. But then the contrast is their appearance has become blacker than soot. They have become unrecognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become dry. It has become as wood. So their appearance has been reduced to a shadow of what it once was. They are now blacker than soot, and black would have been the accumulation of dust unattended to. That's how faces would have become black. It would have been a sign of poverty, and no one knew these people who were once physically magnificent and resplendent creatures. They were unrecognizable in the street. They once stood out like a rare gem, but now they were just just in the masses, and they were emaciated physically, and their bones were sticking out because of their hunger and their famine, and their bones, their physical figures were like wood in that they were only skin and bones and not much in between. Better off were those pierced by the sword than those pierced by hunger, for these pine away, pierced through the lack of the fruits of the field. So he's comparing the comparative experiences in a parallel lens that he compared that of Sodom and Gomorrah to Jerusalem's. He's saying that Sodom was more fortunate to be wasted in a single moment in the twinkling of an eye than we were to endure what we just endured and be left with what we have to contend with now. In this same thing, he likens it to be superior to have been killed during the siege than to be struggling with hunger as those who survived the siege now are, because it was reducing them slowly but surely and painfully. And he likens the hunger as being pierced, the pain of hunger, to a piercing sensation, which comes from the lack of the fruit of the fields. There wasn't, a nation in motion as there once was, even within, 5 short years ago. Food was a fact of life, and they weren't struggling for it. The hands of the merciful woman have boiled their own children. They became food for them, and the destruction of the daughter of my people. So cannibalism was a fact of life, and children were, they didn't have much meat on them, but they were the first to go in the cannibalism. Mothers were reducing to eating their own children, literally, and this is the destruction of the daughter of my people, because there can be no degrading necessity worse conceivable or imaginable for a woman than to be forced to even have to choose to eat your own offspring in order to survive. And we cannot blame them in such a predicament, being creatures of survival, for doing what they did. A lot of us might have done the same thing. Yahweh has completed his wrath. He has poured out his burning displeasure, and he has kindled a fire in Zion, and it consumed her foundations. So here we get to the gist of the matter from here. He has completed his wrath, or satisfied his wrath. The worst of it is over, but they still have to live with the lingering cause and effect consequences. But he has poured, that's a past tense, so there's no more wrath to distribute. There's certainly lingering painful after effects to contend with, but for all intents and purpose from here on out, the wrath is a past article of past tense. And of course, once more, the fire, the object of his consuming rage, which is likened to by a fire in several other places. The object of it was Zion, by connection, the city which hosted it, Jerusalem, and the country to which that capital city belonged to, Judah. And it consumed her foundations. Now, without the foundations, there's going to be no higher level tier of structures. So the foundations are essential and non-negotiable and to be protected at all cost. And that's what we're doing here. We're establishing the foundations and the fundamentals of the faith. But, we also express some of the more advanced doctrine, but never forget or forsake the foundational fundamentals of the faith. I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.